So I think ADHD and creativity, I think, is another possible avenue for study. A sense of humor, people talk about, the mischievous mind, I guess. So those are kind of core, I would say, core positives. But I would say there are other things that you acquire. So I think resilience is a characteristic of people with ADHD.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. I'm Claire, and today we're starting right at the beginning with our inaugural expert guest, Professor Edmund Shanuga-Bark. This opening episode seeks to answer the simple but crucial question, what is ADHD? In order to introduce key information and dispel common misconceptions. We will also discuss how parents can best support their children while navigating the challenges faced along the way, with the reassurance of knowing they are not alone. Professor Edmund is a developmental psychologist who studies the causes, course, and developmental consequences of ADHD. Motivated by his own childhood experiences of learning difficulties, his work aims to improve the life chances of young people with ADHD. To this end, he has developed new ways of thinking about and studying ADHD, using experimental developmental neuroscience methods and theories, leading to new ways of supporting those with ADHD. He is an elected Fellow of the Academy of Medical Scientists, the British Academy, the Danish Academy, and a member of the Academia Europa. Edmund has been included in the clarifies list of most influential researchers in psychology and psychiatry, and he is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. Welcome aboard, Edmund. Welcome aboard, Professor Edmund. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So I'd like to go right back to basics with you, if I may, on this opening episode and start with what might seem like a very simple but yet feels completely crucial opening question. And that is, what is ADHD? Could you provide a kind of brief overview of ADHD for our listeners?
Yeah. Absolutely. So the crucial thing to recognize with ADHD is it's at the bottom line, it's defined as a mental disorder that is marked by three sets of symptoms, or just call them behaviors. That is impulsiveness. So, for instance, doing things without thinking them through properly would be a good example of that. Inattention, for instance, not being able to focus, being easily distracted, or not being able to sustain your attention over time would be examples of that. And then, of course, hyperactivity or hyperkinesis, as it used to be called, which, of course, kind of speaks for itself. Kind of excessive levels of motor activity. So that's the kind of symptom profile. But crucially, that's not ADHD. You diagnose ADHD as a disorder when that leads to a negative impact on a person's daily life. So it's kind of reducing their ability to function on in the daily tasks, whether that's at school or whether that's at home. And that's another crucial aspect. So it's not only got to be impairing, it's got to be pervasive. So that means it's not just a product of one particular environment, that in a way it goes around with the person from environment to environment. So that's another key diagnostic criteria. The next one is that currently, at least, still, it's got to have a childhood onset. So there has to be some evidence that before the age of 12 years, you were affected in a negative way by these symptoms. So it says some evidence, which is really vague. It's not defined very clearly, but that's where they're at. And obviously it requires clinical judgment to make that point. So those are the kind of key elements. And the final one, I suppose, is that it's got to be kind of developmentally inappropriate. Because, of course, if you're 2 years old, you're going to be pretty hyper and inattentive and so forth and so on. Setting your mark by a 2-year-old ADHD isn't really relevant to a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old where the norms are different. So those are the key elements that get you from the behaviors to the disorder. So that means, of course, that there are some aspects of the behaviors, or there may be some people with all those behaviors up to the threshold that's required, who don't have a disorder, because it's not impairing, it's not impacting their daily functioning, which is a kind of often overlooked. Because when you give people the old questionnaires, ADHD questionnaires, everybody says, "Oh, I'm all of those things as well," or these are very common. The point is they've got to meet the other criteria. That's really crucial. And it's a clinical judgment. So in the guidelines for the diagnosis of ADHD, in the NICE guidelines, the National Institute for Clinical Health and Excellence, it says you have to have a specialist. It has to be based on a specialist clinical assessment. No good just going on the old internet and ticking the boxes and saying that. So that's really important, I think, to emphasize. If I could say just a little bit more. So, of course, that's one view of ADHD, of those behaviors and the other characteristics. Of course, there is a competing view that is gaining a lot of traction, and this comes from this so-called neurodiversity perspective, where the concept of a disorder is completely rejected, and the idea that ADHD, even where impairing, is really just a difference or atypicality rather than a disorder, and that the impairment doesn't kind of follow on from the condition itself, but is created because of the environment that the person's in, being unsympathetic or non-affirmative or something like that. So there are these competing ideas of what ADHD is, and it is still a very contested concept, I think. Yeah.
It's very interesting, particularly as you say, there's the medicalized clinical approach and then the neurodiversity paradigm, if that's the right word. But I guess underlying all of that is the way that it impairs and impacts life. So I wondered if you could perhaps give us some examples on how ADHD impacts daily life, and what challenges children and indeed their parents might face.
Yeah. Now, it's very important not to get too negative.
Yes,
But it's
absolutely.
very easy to get dragged down that down that route, because in a way that's the way we framed it all. But if we're looking at impacts, we can talk about short-term impacts and long-term impacts. So obviously, the impact depends on a whole set of factors. You can find people with ADHD who have little difficulty in relations at home, because home, in a way, has adapted and probably also contains people who have ADHD there too, given the kind of familial heritable nature of it, but have really serious problems with peers and at school in terms of establishing relationships, focusing on schoolwork and so forth. So it's very setting specific. I think that's really important to highlight in terms of the short-term impacts. In terms of the longer-term impacts, so there's a whole literature on the risk that ADHD, they often say if untreated, but even when treated sometimes, can produce kind of negative effects, for instance, in terms of educational attainment. So there's quite a reasonable size association between ADHD and school failure, for instance. Although it's definitely not deterministic, and many people with ADHD do really well at school, but there's a statistical association. Or, for instance, with delinquency, there's a statistical association. Again, really important to emphasize, doesn't affect everybody, or even the majority, probably, and depends on circumstances. In terms of substance use, there's an association. In terms of relationships, there's an association. In terms of employment status, there's an association. So sometimes you hear see researchers, even great researchers, they sometimes get a little bit carried away, and they might use terms like has a catastrophic effect on life chances of individuals. ADHD has which I would say is a little bit florid. But on the other hand, not to diminish the risks associated with ADHD and the need to intervene appropriately. Yeah.
So if we go maybe briefly into some of the specifics of the impairments, if you're perhaps a parent listening to this who's at the very beginning of this journey, those impairments, what might you see and how might they differ between genders?
Yeah, such an important point. So I think just to highlight the sex differences for a minute. So where ADHD came from as an idea, as a concept, of course, it was pretty much a male concept. It came out of, this is before evidence-based medicine, of course, it came out of probably the consulting room where people's had experiences of dealing with young boys, typically, or perhaps always, who had these patterns of difficult behavior. And that kind of became enshrined as the diagnosis. Whereas, of course, we now know girls can have ADHD, but that it's often overlooked because it takes a somewhat different form. And I think that's a crucial aspect. So not just in terms of impairments, but in terms of the actual symptoms and behavior, are probably somewhat different. Hyperactivity is less marked probably in girls. Or, I mean, it's just to say, I mean, we're still investigating. We have a program of research looking into the expression of ADHD in girls from their perspective and the perspective of young women who had a diagnosis of as children, kind of reviewing their lives and trying to get a sense of what constitutes ADHD in girls, rather than relying on the male diagnostic criteria. So we're still working on it. We don't know precisely, exactly what are the optimal symptoms, if you like, or the optimal criteria for female ADHD. But in terms of male ADHD, I think it varies as the child grows. So, of course, in preschool, the hyperactivity and is the predominant factor, probably. Maybe impulsivity is the predominant factor in terms of impacting the ability to engage constructively in early education, engage constructively with other kids, which of course are both crucial part of that kind of preschool period. The entry into school creates particular challenges, I think, for people with ADHD. As the structures start to grow, then and the demands start to grow in terms of attention in particular, then the difficulties become more apparent. And so it's actually quite a transactional process whereby the child's behavior impacts the environment, and then the environment then feeds back and starts to impact the child's self-concept, self-esteem, and so forth as the child grows. Then you start to get a kind of a wonky self-concept as you grow, because you're having a lot of negative feedback coming from other kids, very importantly, but also, of course, from educational establishment. And then, the demands and the constraints change over time as kids go through middle childhood, and into adolescence is another big threshold or another big watershed where difficulties develop.
So you mentioned self-esteem there, which I think is a really, really important one. Obviously, as a mum of a child with ADHD myself, it's something I focus a lot on. So what are some of the strengths? Because you said let's not get completely bogged down in the negative. Let's focus on maybe some of the positives for a moment. What are some of the strengths associated with ADHD that often go unnoticed in your view?
Yeah, they have gone unnoticed, and historically, I think, and there has not really been much focus in the science or the research on positive aspects of ADHD, but people are starting to focus on them. Partly because, obviously, I think people are starting to feel more comfortable talking about their own ADHD rather than just relying on the assessment. So, I mean, the ones that people highlight and emphasize are obviously energy and enthusiasm. I mean, these are neither of them, of course, mentioned in the diagnosis of ADHD, but fairly common, at least noted. And I think I'm thinking about the research that's available. There isn't much, as I say, but I think are supported by the research. So those are two important pluses, I think. I think and I don't want to over romanticize it, which is always a risk, but the way that the ADHD brain works, I think, is a very good counterpoint to the way the neurotypical brain works. And I was actually just writing a blog that somebody asked me to write. And my first title was In Praise of the Meandering, Mischievous, or Magpie Mind. Because I think, I think that taking a different route, picking up like magpies, picking up nice shiny things and putting little things together in your mind, or a sort of intellectual sense of humor almost, where you're kind of seeing funny things that nobody else really sees, I think are great benefits towards creativity. Now that's not really been explored, but it seems so obvious to me. At least it's intuitive, and certainly to me seems a really good thing to investigate, at least. So I think ADHD and creativity, I think, is another possible avenue for study. A sense of humor, people talk about it, the mischievous mind, I guess. So those are kind of I would say core positives. But I would say there are other things that you acquire. So I think resilience is a characteristic of people with ADHD, basically because in the old adage, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger adage, assuming it doesn't kill you. But it's I think that you develop that resilience. I think as you grow. I also think probably you develop alternative ways of doing things that can give you interesting perspectives on life. So, given, if you find it difficult to concentrate and focus, you develop different ways of concentrating and focusing, of chunking information, or, organizing your environment so that you can get your work done. One of the ones that I'm fascinated in is this whole thing of hyperfocus. Now, hyperfocus is often described as a negative, in the sense you sort of get hooked into distracting things and get off track. But I think many effective people with ADHD, as they grow, they learn how to use hyperfocus, to switch it on, to actually get some work done. And I think that becomes so. I think it's a developmental consideration. What are the advantages? So the issue then, people come back and they'll say, well, that isn't because they're ADHD. That's just in spite of the fact they're ADHD. So I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know if we've really figured it out yet, whether it's just a positive that just happens to be there alongside ADHD, or is it actually part of the fundamental nature. The other thing to say, of course, is, and I realise it's a slight digression, is that there is no such thing as an ADHD person, because everybody with ADHD is so different. It's incredibly heterogeneous. A lot of our research in the neuroscience of ADHD has tried to characterise that kind of variety of ADHD in terms of its underlying genetics, its underlying neuroscience, its underlying, whatever. So I think that's the other point, just to say it's very hard. You can't really generalize, but you can identify qualities that are associated with different types of ADHD, I suppose, one way to think about it. Yeah. So that's a bit of a meandering answer, actually. But I think I got there in the end.
Absolutely. And, that variety, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I think it's a really important one, that there are characteristics of this, but, every single person with ADHD is different. They will present differently. But that probably leads in to a degree to the fact that there are lots of common misconceptions about ADHD, of which many people are being fed via media headlines or social media. And so I'd quite like to address some of those with you, if I may. What are some of the myths that you frequently encounter about ADHD, and what does the research say about them?
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, the research isn't always unanimous in addressing any of the myths, unfortunately. But there are millions, of course, and it's as I say, it's quite a contested concept still, and it's a very polarized concept. And so the myths, in a sense, emerge on both sides of the polarization. So, for instance, you might have a myth that ADHD kids are just naughty, which is a common myth, which is clearly untrue. On the other hand, people who react against that myth almost deny agency in ADHD by saying ADHD kids can't be naughty. Well, of course they can. So it's always somewhere in the middle between these polar extremes, like medication. Some people argue medication is a terrible thing and poisonous and blah, 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 and people are going to get addicted. Most of those myths are actually untrue. But on the other hand, people counter that myth by going too far the other way, by exaggerating the benefits of medication, and so it's always somewhere in between the two extreme polar myths that are in the field. So, another one would be, if you go to the extreme, it links with the medication one, really, I suppose. But by the way, my view on medication is it's an essential part of the management of ADHD in many cases. That would be my view, but it's not the answer in and of itself, but it can have a really important benefit and value. That would be my considered view after all these years of researching it. Anyway, for what it's worth, but it's a kind of a middle view. I would say it's a kind of opens up a window for development, essentially, and all the other important influences on development that need to be addressed for the kid with ADHD. So, so one of the other myths, of course, it just doesn't exist. It's been made up. It's purely a social construct. People react against that with the equally clumsy notion that it's purely a genetic disorder, and the truth is in the middle. Of course, it's a social construct. Every psychiatric condition is a social construct, whether it's schizophrenia or they're all social constructs. We think about them sometimes. I've used the notion that it's actually like a working hypothesis from a science perspective, but it also has a biological basis. There's no contradiction in those two elements. And it's also associated with impairment, whether or not it's a social construct. So it's not an illusion. It has a social meaning, and that meaning has been constructed over time. But it also has a clinical meaning, and it also has other meanings, probably true. So, most of these myths kind of depend on really clumsy thinking, actually, and at both ends of the spectrum. Yeah, I remember once a very eminent researcher who is very dedicated to the medical model of ADHD for all the right reasons, helping people with ADHD, being presented at a meeting with data showing that what we thought about the brain in ADHD was probably exaggerated. And that this new study, which was a massive study, showed rather subtle effects on the brain. And he stood up and he just said, I just don't believe it. And if you support this, that means you're anti-ADHD, even though the evidence was in front of him. So, do you know what I mean? It's like people just reacting to the other side, and you get into a sterile standoff between the advocates and the critics. Whereas, of course, usually it's in the middle somewhere. And just because the brain effects are subtle doesn't reduce the clinical meaning and impact of the condition. Again, it's like clumsy thinking. It's like making a false comparison or a false equivalence or a false link. So I think, yeah. So I'm not. That's me. I love philosophy of science, so that probably went a bit off into philosophy of science. But yeah, it's. I think there are myths on both sides, and it's usually somewhere in the middle with sensible approach, recognizing the seriousness of the condition and coming up with a balanced response that ultimately the goal is to make people with ADHD thrive. That's the goal, and we just need to all get on the same path. And most people are, I would say. Well, another common myth, of course, is around diet, that ADHD is just about diet. And if you sort the diet out, you will get rid of the ADHD. However, of course, that's not true. But that doesn't mean that diet, for some people, doesn't play a role, or doesn't play a role. So that for some people who have food intolerances, it can be a factor. We've done lots of reviews, but we've also I was involved in a very pivotal trial published in the Lancet 2007, where we showed that taking out food additives and colorings, artificial colorings, preservatives and flavorings from a diet in a controlled way did reduce levels of hyperactivity and inattention in a double-blind, really, really well-designed trial that say it ourselves. And but it was very small effect, but it did have an effect. So, that could all play into kind of complex set of causes and increase the risk of difficulty. And so taking those out, probably a good thing to do in general, good kind of food hygiene, if you like, food health hygiene. The other one is fish oil. People talk about fatty acids, and again, they have a little benefit. They do have a little benefit from the trials. It looks like it's very small, but and might be useful. So again, you get caught in these extreme positions where it's just diet, and then the field reacts, diet doesn't play a role at all. In fact, somewhere in the middle. At least that's the way I've reviewed that's the way I interpret the literature.
That balance is, I guess, key because it's quite an emotive subject, isn't it? So naturally, people respond quite sensitively to some of these things. But is there a myth or a particular stereotype that you feel most passionate about, or you'd like to erase?
Not particularly. I wouldn't say. I don't think. I mean, I would say I like to be science-driven, evidence-based, and humane. That's the way That's how I describe my approach. I do think, just to sidestep slightly the personal question, I do think that ADHD is still incredibly stigmatized, and I think the shame that we feel about having ADHD is still very profound. And I'd say that more than, for instance, other things, probably. For some reason, I don't know why, but I do. I do think, which must relate to myths and stereotypes, I guess, about ADHD. And it's much easier to say you're dyslexic. I think it may even be much easier to say you're autistic. But there is some set of stereotypes that come along with ADHD that makes it very difficult for people, no matter what they say, not to react in a suspicious and negative way, perhaps. That maintains that whole stigmatizing process that I think is very toxic. I don't know what the answer is to it, because I don't know if maybe it's kind of pretty hard. Some of these things are pretty hardwired in people, into cultures and societies, to be kind of suspicious and rejecting of certain traits. I do think it's a massive negative in the lives of people with ADHD, that we somehow have to get on top of as a culture and as a society, I would say. Often people talk about, is it the label, the diagnosis, or is it the behaviour that's stigmatized? And I would say, my view is it's not the label, it's actually the behaviour. I think the stigma starts from people's reactions to the presence that people with ADHD tend to have. Whether that's, people feel uncomfortable with the energy, with the enthusiasm, with the challenges in focusing and sustaining attention and moving from topic to topic, and maybe they're not just uncomfortable, maybe they feel a bit intimidated by it, actually, so, as well, potentially. So I would say that's not really a myth, but it must be built on some myths. Do you see what I mean? Around around the meaning of those behaviours. So yeah, that's a bit negative, isn't it? But I think if we don't identify the problem, we're probably not going to deal with it.
I'm glad that you raised that, actually, because I think, speaking as a parent here who has been through that journey, certainly right at the beginning, that does play a huge part in it, because the stigma is there, the shame is there, and even if we don't quite know why, I think there's an association, and countering that, some of that is a big part of those first steps. So Maybe for the parents listening who believe that their child has ADHD, perhaps it's something that school have flagged, but are right at the beginning of this journey and they're listening to this and it's kind of ringing true, and perhaps how they feel about even that being a possibility. Where do they start? Like, what's the first thing they should do?
I mean, the obvious things are to say, obviously, get reliable, high quality, evidence based information. That may be easier said than done, actually, because there is so much, as you say, myth and confusion out there on both sides of the discussion. It's also, of course, quite difficult to get access to information from our National Health Service at the moment, I'm afraid to say. As you're probably aware, the waiting lists for evaluations are very, very long at the moment. And many people, of course, if they can afford it, go and get private evaluation and initiation of treatment. So I would definitely say go to the experts. Don't rely on a lot of the stuff that's available on the internet. It's always angled in a particular way. I would say I would say the NICE guidelines are a good place to start, probably. I mean, it is obviously clearly coming from a medical perspective. There is a lot that one needs to do over and above that, but it's probably a good place to begin to look at kind of what's reliable information. So I would probably say try and get an appointment with your GP. That's still probably the best option. They probably won't be experts. Unfortunately, we do, or they may even feel uncomfortable giving a referral. I know that sometimes is the case, but I think you still do need a referral to get into an NHS pathway, and then hopefully you'll get an expert assessment via that route. As I said, I realise it's all clogged up at the moment. I think that's the key. I would say definitely timely assessment is important. And one way or the other, it may be the case that there isn't really an issue. But if you leave it too long, there is a danger that you sort of get down negative developmental pathways, whereby, as we talked about, the whole self-concept thing starts to develop, and then the whole emotional difficulties start to emerge, particularly during adolescence. So if we can nip that possible sort of progression into mental health difficulties or behavioral difficulties, I think needs a timely assessment. I would say it's equally important for boys and girls, but I think it's more typical for girls to be left longer, partly because of the stereotypes that nobody really, girls don't kind of enter into the picture almost. And so there's a tendency perhaps to think, oh no, it can't be true. Do you see what I mean? It's like putting it off, then until maybe not too late, never too late, but probably could have benefited from an earlier assessment. Yeah, early is always, and even to put you out, even to to resolve doubts, or to clarify that there isn't an issue, and so forth. So I would that will be my recommendation. My other one would be, don't be frightened of medication if it's indicated by the clinician. A lot of parents are frightened by it, but my experience, although I'm not a clinician, I should make that clear. I'm a researcher and a personal experience with ADHD. But my experience is that it can have massive impact in many cases, just in terms of breaking that negative pathway and cycle. It's not the total answer, but it's an important component, I would say. I mean, obviously, it's up to every parent. Every parent has their own views, but I think it's. I would say I wouldn't be frightened of it.
You mentioned personal experience there, and I know much of your work is motivated by your own experiences growing up. So, what one piece of advice would you like to leave parents listening to help them on this journey?
I mean, I spent a majority of my professional career not really discussing my own childhood history of ADHD and neurodivergence, dyslexia at all. So I was just, in a way, I think I went to science because I wanted to kind of, what's the word? I don't know, is transference, or I'm not sure what it is, but kind of distancing myself from the experience. But of course, that's come back to bite me now. I think because I'm working with so many young people with ADHD and other neurodiversity, that in a sense, a total hypocrite if I not acknowledge my own childhood, or what my own life. So I guess one thing I would say is, this is, I guess, for people, many parents of kids with ADHD do have ADHD themselves. That is an important part. And I think it's really important not to let that interfere. If that's you, or you think it might be you, don't let that interfere with the way your reaction to your own child's difficulty by either denial or, because, do you see what I mean? Because like you've had that experience and you kind of may be kind of not wanting to visit it on your kids. And so you kind of put off the reality of the situation. I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but it just seems, to me, it seems really, really, it's really important to kind of disentangle yourself from your own child's circumstances. I think I would probably say that. I'm sure I'll come up with a better answer if I probably will after we finish the interview. But
I think that's very good advice, because, as you say, these things are often very closely linked, whether we know it or not at the time. If I speak from my personal experience, I didn't know that, but on that journey with my son, that resulted in me having an adult diagnosis. But there's definitely moments where, you can sense that the fight and the advocacy for them is a little bit in part for yourself. Or there's moments where you have to catch and manage your own ADHD behaviours and symptoms to ensure that you're managing the situation for them in the best way possible. And it's not an easy thing to do by any means, but I do think it's a really important one.
I would say, though, what I think, and I'm no good at it myself, but be compassionate to yourself. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody. And maybe people with ADHD make more mistakes, I don't know. But yeah, just be compassionate, to yourself, and forgive yourself when you make mistakes and start again. And I think that's probably pretty good advice too, actually. And not just people with ADHD, but all parents, of course. I think that's probably that's my advice. Yeah, be kind to yourself. Look after yourself. You're no good for your kids if you're not looking after yourself. I think that's important. I probably don't follow that. The other thing I would say, if I was talking to people with ADHD from my own personal experience, find yourself a wonderful wife or a wonderful husband. I can't tell you. I mean, and it's probably a common experience, but I think we owe our non-ADHD spouses a lot. I would say, in my own personal experience, it may not be the case for others, but that's what I would say. So if my wife Funke is listening, there you go.
I was going to say, I'm sure that's very lovely, and that your wife will be very glad to hear it.
She'd probably be upset that I mentioned her, but that is the real truth of the matter. I think Mike, my old boss, Professor Sir Michael Rutter, the wonderful researcher and psychiatrist, he did some studies where the key turning point in most young people that had a difficult life in their childhood, adolescence, was finding a good partner. It's a turning point. It took them out of that trajectory. And I think that's good advice.
That is good advice.
Well, I would, because I just made it.
That is good advice. And as you said, take good care of yourself. I think that's a really lovely note to end on. So, Edmund, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today.
I hope it's all right.
Absolutely. You have the most amazing ability to communicate in a clear, concise, compassionate, like almost a gentle way that makes this very complex topic that can be super emotive, perhaps even overwhelming at the beginning, feel really accessible for everybody listening. So thank you. And thank you also for the dedication and all your work, for the difference that you're making to all of the lives of our children with ADHD. So thank you. We are truly grateful for your time and your wisdom.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
If you'd like to learn more about Professor Edmund's work, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. And if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard.